Hello, everyone. So we are going to be starting Unit 3 with the new government, and let's go ahead and start with Washington as president. So you have George Washington, the one and only, unanimously selected as president in 1789. He kept saying throughout this entire process, apparently, I walk on untrodden ground. He had a very tricky situation. He had to make the presidency powerful enough to function effectively in the national government, but at the same time, these practices couldn't show any tendency of drifting toward a monarchy or a dictatorship. So he was skirting a very thin line. His presidential campaign cost $0, FYI, so that's pretty cool. He did no public campaigning, and he was so humble actually in this aspect. He even cast doubt whether he should have the job. After he was appointed, he actually had said that he had no wish or desire beyond living as a private citizen. That's what made him happy. However, there were 69 electoral votes, and he actually won the support of every single one of them. And actually, in the following election in 1792, he received all the votes from the Electoral College. There were more votes then, but he got all of them again. So, and since, obviously, no other president has come into office with a universal mandate to take office. So he won all the electors in 10 eligible states. 3 states didn't contribute to the vote, actually. North Carolina and Rhode Island were ineligible because neither had ratified the Constitution. Remember, Rhode Island was the last. North Carolina was second to last. New York was unable to participate. They had not passed a bill in time to appoint their electors. And so, anyway, later on in 1792, there were 132 electoral votes. And so he won 15 states. I always thought that this was really cool. First Lady Martha Washington, the first lady, she had her own inauguration celebration. And it lasted for 11 days, which was 3 days longer than Washington's. I don't know. I always thought that was funny. So each elector was supposed to cast 2 votes. Second place was actually John Adams. He was inaugurated in 2 cities, believe it or not, New York and Philadelphia. D.C. was not the seat yet until 1800, so keep that in mind. And he, again, had the biggest task upon him, putting the government together from scratch. Washington sets a lot of precedents forward. This, again, you learned about precedents at least last year in civics and economics if you hadn't learned about it previously. This is an earlier event or an action that is regarded as an example or a guide for the future. And so he puts together a lot of different actions and he establishes different precedents. So he creates his cabinet. This actually was established in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. Their role is to advise the president in their specific department. And the current cabinet has 16 members. He only had 4. So he had Thomas Jefferson, which we'll talk about in a minute, as the Secretary of State. Spoiler alert. Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. Yes, cannot wait to talk about him. And then Secretary of War Henry Knox, and then the Attorney General, General Edmund Randolph. So we'll talk about that. He defines appointment powers. He made his selections actually based on a rational process. The British tradition was based on a social hierarchy, personal relationships, who you knew was the most important. He put people into their jobs based on what he called fitness for the job, or what is really referred to now as merit. Were you qualified? He even rejected his own nephew for a U.S. attorney job because he felt that other people were more qualified. Future President John Adams actually he said that no one has a certain amount of pull with George Washington because he was adamant in making sure that people had what was called fitness for their job. Then at the very end today, we'll talk about the 2 terms that he served. He walked away after 2 terms, 4 years as president, and then he is the leader of foreign affairs. And we'll talk about how he also gets some advice with the head of departments. So you have during this time the passing of the Bill of Rights. Remember, that's the first 10 amendments of the 27. And then you have the Judiciary Act that comes through. This establishes the different courts that are set up. The Supreme Court, you're fully aware. You learned about these different courts in civics, so we're not going to go in depth. Also sets up the district courts and the courts of appeal. This was extremely important. Then you have the executive departments that are set up. And here where you see GW, obviously, hopefully you put together that was George Washington. That's what that stands for. So first, you have the Secretary of State, and George Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as the very first. The Secretary of State is supposed to be the advisor, the main advisor on U.S. foreign policy. They negotiate relations with foreign affairs. That is extremely helpful. Advises the president whenever appointing different ambassadors, ministers, or diplomats. They negotiate treaties and agreements. They interpret those agreements, and they administer the State Department. So it's a big job. Then you have the Department of War. So the Secretary of War, the very first one, you have Henry Knox. So for this department, they are responsible for all military affairs. That includes naval affairs. Interesting fact about Henry Knox that I actually did not know until very recently. According to multiple accounts, Henry Knox died after swallowing a chicken bone. Just felt like sharing that. He swallowed a chicken bone at a picnic, and it somehow caused, oh my gosh, this is so bad. It caused an infection, and he died from the infection 3 days later. That is awful to me. Anyways, that was the first Secretary of War. Now, Secretary of the Treasury, you have an appointment of Alexander Hamilton. The Secretary of Treasury, this one probably will be the easiest to put together. They act as the principal advisor to the president and the cabinet as a whole on economic issues, oversees the Treasury Department. They're responsible for paying the bills of the nation, printing money, collecting taxes, doing things of that nature. So it is another huge job. These departments are very, very important. And there are even more departments that branch out later on. Okay, so let's talk about Alexander Hamilton's economic plan. We're going to spend a lot of the rest of the time talking about Hamilton and Jefferson. So there was a major problem facing the federal government. They were in financial chaos. Economic survival was something that was very much so at the forefront of Alexander Hamilton's mind. Some people weren't necessarily thinking about that at the time. A lot of people were concerned with foreign affairs and whatnot, but economic survival was at the front of Hamilton's mind and others. But anyways, so there was a lot of financial chaos that was brought on by the American Revolution. States had huge war debts. There was runaway inflation. So whenever George Washington chose Hamilton, remember Hamilton was a war vet. He was a Revolutionary War hero. He was supposed to take on this huge challenge of directing federal economic policy and being the Secretary of the Treasury. So he had to come up with a huge plan. This guy rose to fame fairly quickly. He came from very humble means. He was born in the West Indies to very modest origins. And so he rose to fame very quickly. This idea of the first bank of the United States was a way to standardize the American currency and to really cope with the Revolutionary War debt. Because remember, a common currency with the before the Revolutionary War and then after, between the states, it was difficult. There was no standard. So he wanted to standardize the currency and then pay those debts. So the first issue that he wanted to tackle was the problem of public credit. So the governments at all levels, they'd taken on so much debt that the commitment to pay them back was not really taken seriously. So by the late 1780s ish, the state IOUs, or money that was borrowed to finance the revolution, those IOUs were basically considered worthless. So Hamilton came forward with this idea, said that the federal government should pay off all of these state debts at full value. So here you have the full assumption of debt, that paying off those debts. And we'll talk about why people are just upset about this. There was a feeling that this kind of action would enhance the legitimacy of the new government, that we would be seen as more legitimate, that we would just not be up to our eyeballs in debt, that we would be paying off our debts and moving forward as a nation. So Hamilton's vision for reshaping this economy included this Bank of the United States that I'd spoken about. And it was modeled to be similar to the Bank of England. To make this more stable, you had to have a common paper currency to make it more stable. So there was a lot of opposition about this national bank. So you had a lot of people that feared it would fall under the influence of the wealthy. And you had people like Jefferson, who felt that the South was not really a region that was in very much debt. So they did not feel that they needed to assume all of these debts, because that was giving a lot of power to the national bank, that was giving a lot of power to the federal government, and why should the South front that much money? Then there was the idea of, is this constitutional? Because Jefferson didn't believe the Constitution gave Congress the right to establish a national bank. This economic plan, and a lot of it being the national bank, leads to a split in the cabinet. So George Washington begrudgingly approves the bank because he sees it as the only way to push the nation forward. Now, here on the left, you have Alexander Hamilton, and then on the right, you have Thomas Jefferson. They were the biggest of rivals at this point. And we'll talk why. Now, before we get into this, another part of Alexander Hamilton's economic plan was to make American manufacturers self-sufficient. So this is just showing how he was very pro manufacturing. There wasn't really much of an emphasis placed on farmers and more agriculturally based areas. So that is one thing that I do want to highlight about Alexander Hamilton. And people thought that he was very elitist in general. Let's dive farther into really the big disagreement in the cabinet and what is the major difference between Hamilton and Jefferson. This is extremely important. It will be on your test. It will be on your next quiz. It's very important to dive into. So first of all, the Federalists, these are the group of supporters that are surrounding Hamilton. And then you have the Democratic Republicans that surround Jefferson. So, first of all, regarding the central government and the state government, you had Hamilton, who wanted a powerful central government, because one of his biggest fear is mob rule. Like with Shays' Rebellion, it was not able to be quelled because the central government was so weak. However, Thomas Jefferson, his fear was to have too strong of a central government because things could go back to the way it was with the British. You could have a too powerful central government, and then they could take rights away from citizens. So he favored a strong state government. Now, the interpretation of the Constitution is another place where they have some serious disagreements. Jefferson believed that the Constitution did not give Congress the power to create the national bank. So you need to interpret the Constitution in a strict fashion. However, Alexander Hamilton felt that a loose interpretation was sufficient. So he believed in the use of the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause, as we've talked about before. And then obviously, Alexander Hamilton is going to be pro-national bank. That is his baby. That is what he was working on. That was his project. And again, Jefferson does not like the national bank for many reasons. He felt that the bank could have a negative tie between the bank and the wealthy, didn't feel it was constitutional, and there were just so many things. And like I had said previously, Hamilton wanted to support manufacturers. He wanted to take away the dependence on expensive foreign goods, and he felt that relying on these goods kept the economy at a limited level. And so he wanted to adopt this mercantilist economic policy that would protect American manufacturers through these government subsidies, which are basically they're handouts to businesses, and tariffs. And hopefully you remember what a tariff is. This is a tax on imported goods. And so this is known as a protectionist policy. And we'll talk about this a lot more later. And so this would help American producers to compete with inexpensive European imports. So he wanted to help manufacturers, while Jefferson was more focused on farmers and the agricultural areas. Then you had Hamilton with a lot of the things in which he lived, or a lot of the ways that he lived his life. He was very pro-England. He wanted the new United States to function more like England. The National Bank looked a lot like Bank in England. And then Jefferson, who spent a lot of time in France, had a lot of friends that were French, wanted to be more like France. And then a lot of the supporters for the Federalists and for Hamilton lived in the North, even though he did have his share of people who did not like him in the North. But a lot of Federalists, that's where they were typically living. And then Jefferson had a lot of supporters in the South and in the West. We need to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. I know we've talked about Bacon's Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. So basically at this point, we have farmers that, again, I feel like farmers, unfortunately, they get the unfortunate end of everything. Farmers were hurting again, big time. They had been bartering whiskey in the frontier economy. And so to barter, basically that's like a direct trade. And so distillers were hurt by paying this new tax that was levied to help the economy. And whiskey bartering beforehand had been as good as like paying with gold. It was used for medicine, drinking, and cooking. And so it basically like gold. I mean, it would be traded just for that reason. Washington wasn't a fan of this tax that was placed on whiskey. He had actually went around asking opinions previously, but there were certain local governments that were okay with it, so he eventually went with it. So in 1794, you had farmers in Pennsylvania. They rebelled against Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey. The people refused to pay. And so at this point, it was hard for some of these farmers to really see that the national government was $54 million in debt. And that was in 1700s money. But whenever you are a poor farmer, it'd be difficult, obviously, if you were used to living your life a certain way and you were struggling. So in these riots, several federal officers were killed. And this was because they were trying to serve arrest warrants to the offenders. So Washington sent in an army and put down the rebellion. And the main thing you need to know is that the incident showed that the new government under the Constitution could react swiftly and effectively to such a problem. It is in direct contrast to what happened with Shays' Rebellion, where the government they tried, but they couldn't put down the rebellion because the government was too weak. So this was a true test of the federal government. All right, pretty quickly, we have this very, 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 very unpopular trade treaty with Britain. This was negotiated by John Jay. We had talked about him multiple times. Basically, it said that, or the purpose of Jay's treaty was to foster a positive relationship with the British. And part of it was that the British were supposed to pay for American ships that had been seized in 1793, and that Americans had to pay British merchants debts that were owed from before the Revolution, and the British had to agree to remove their troops from the Ohio River Valley. So you had, again, this major split. The Democratic Republicans and Jefferson, they favored peace with France, so they were angry. They were very angry. Close ties with the British led some people to believe that this could bring them at this time back to a monarchy. And so you also had Washington, Hamilton, and John Jay. Obviously, it was treaty. They were big supporters. They said the treaty was economically sound and was necessary to foster that positive relationship and keep moving forward. Then you had Pinckney's Treaty. It's pretty straightforward. So Spain granted us the right to navigate the Mississippi, and that's what this map is showing. To navigate the Mississippi and to deposit goods in New Orleans. And here's the key thing here. We're open to shipping, and it establishes the intentions of friendship between us and Spain. We want to preserve neutrality because that's what we're going to talk about next. So, with the French Revolution, remember learning about this in world history? Hopefully you do. French Revolution began in 1789, ended in the late 90s, with Napoleon Bonaparte coming to power. So, with the French Revolution, remember the French came to our aid during the American Revolution. Basically, we kind of helped out at first, yeah? And then whenever things got to be really bad, we pulled off. We pulled out support. And then whenever France and Britain, remember the French and the British were in war, were at war with each other, we declared neutrality. So there were a good number of people that felt a certain way about this. The French came to our aid. Where were we? But a lot of people also did feel that we needed to stay neutral at this time. We were trying to put ourselves together. Okay, so the Treaty of Greenville, this was actually a treaty to negotiate peace between the U.S. government and the native tribes in the old Northwest Territory, and to get some more land. So part of the treaty established a boundary between the lands that the natives could have and then the ones that were open to settlement. George Washington decides after 2 terms he is going to walk away. Remember, he was hesitant about coming in to be the president anyway. He serves his 2 terms, and in his farewell address, which was eloquent and wonderful, he has his 2 very, very, very famous farewell warnings that were not followed. Spoiler alert. Which if you are conscious and breathing, you know that those 2 things were not listened to. So he said, number 1, no foreign affairs. Stay out of everything, basically. And number 2, no political parties. Well, there was already a split in the cabinet. Already a split. Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on absolutely nothing. They were fighting over everything. They were complete opposite people. And we will talk about how this only continues to get worse, and these political parties already have taken shape. And Washington walks away. So that is the end of this today, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day.